Like, share, and subscribe to my channel.
In football, mistakes are supposed to disappear with time. A bad pass. A missed tackle. A shot over the bar. A goalkeeper's mistake. An own goal. For most players, these moments become painful memories. They are replayed by fans, discussed by journalists, and may be remembered for a few years. But eventually, life moves on. For Andrés Escobar, one mistake followed him home. It happened on June 22, 1994, at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, California. Colombia were playing the United States in the World Cup. The stadium was filled with noise, color, flags, and expectation. On the surface, it was just another football match. But for Colombia, it was more than that. This team had arrived in America carrying the hopes of an entire nation. They were talented. They were respected. They were expected to go far. Some people had even spoken of them as possible champions. They were not supposed to collapse in the group stage. They were not supposed to lose to the host nation. And Andrés Escobar, calm, disciplined, and respected, was not supposed to become the symbol of that collapse. Then came the cross. The ball was driven low across Colombia's penalty area. Escobar moved to intercept it. In football, defenders make that movement thousands of times. A simple touch. A block. A clearance. A split-second decision. But this time, the ball struck his leg and changed direction. It rolled into his own net. For a moment, the stadium erupted. For Escobar, time must have stopped. He turned, looked toward the goal, and realized what had happened. The scoreboard had changed. The United States had taken the lead. Colombia's World Cup dream had cracked open. But nobody in that stadium could have understood the darkness attached to that moment. To the American fans, it was a goal. To the Colombian fans, it was disaster. To Andrés Escobar, it was a mistake. But days later, in Medellín, that mistake would become part of a murder case. This is not just a story about football. It is a story about pressure, violence, national pride, organized crime, and one player who became trapped between a game and a country that had forgotten where sport ended and rage began. The world would remember him as the footballer killed after an own. Before the own goal, before the headlines, before the murder, Andrés Escobar was known for something very different. He was not remembered as reckless. He was not remembered as arrogant. He was not remembered as violent. He was remembered as a gentleman. In Colombia, people called him El Caballero del Fútbol, the gentleman of football. He was calm on the pitch, respectful off it, and admired for the way he carried himself. At a time when Colombian society was scarred by violence, corruption, fear, and drug cartel power, Escobar represented something cleaner. He was the kind of player people wanted children to admire. He played for Atlético Nacional, one of Colombia's great clubs. He was also part of a national team that gave people hope at a time when the country badly needed it. Colombia in the early 1990s was not only known for its football. Internationally, it was associated with cocaine trafficking, bombings, assassinations, and cartel violence. Football became an escape. When Colombia played well, people saw another version of their country. Not the country of fear. Not the country shown on crime reports. A country of skill, rhythm, pride, and beauty. And Escobar was part of that image. He was not the flashiest player. He was a defender, and defenders often live in the background. They do the difficult work. They stop danger. They organize. They protect. When they play well, people may not notice. When they make one mistake, the whole world sees it. That is the cruel life of a defender. For Andrés, football was also moral. He believed the sport could help Colombia appear differently to the world. The national team was not just a team. It was a message. It said Colombia was more than violence. More than drugs. More than fear. But around Colombian football, there was another reality. Money from powerful criminal figures had entered parts of the sport. Clubs could become symbols of power. Matches could be tied to gambling. Victories could become pride for men who were not used to losing. The line between football and the underworld was sometimes dangerously thin. Andrés Escobar lived in the middle of that world, but he was not like that world. That is what makes the story painful. A man remembered for dignity was destroyed by an environment where dignity had little protection. The gentleman walked into the World Cup carrying hope. He would leave it carrying blame. The 1994 World Cup was supposed to be Colombia's moment. They had qualified in stunning style. Their football was smooth, confident, and fearless. Players like Carlos Valderrama, Faustino Asprilla, Freddy Rinson, and Andrés Escobar made Colombia feel like something special. They had talent, personality, and belief. The world noticed. Expectations grew. But expectations can become dangerous when a country places too much weight on 11 men. Colombia were not entering the tournament as underdogs who could simply enjoy the ride. They were entering as a team people expected to win. The pressure was enormous. Back home, fans believed. Journalists believed. Politicians believed. Gamblers believed. Criminal groups with money tied to football also believed. That is where sport becomes frightening. Because when ordinary fans lose hope, they feel sadness. When violent men lose money, they may look for someone to punish. Colombia's first match was against Romania. It was supposed to be the beginning of something big. Instead, it became the first crack. Romania won 3-1. Colombia looked shaken. The team that had arrived with swagger suddenly looked heavy, nervous, and uncertain. Then came the United States. For the American team, the match was a chance to shock the world. For Colombia, it was almost a survival match. Lose, and the dream would be nearly dead. The Rose Bowl was bright, loud, and full of World Cup energy. But behind Colombia's players, there was pressure the crowd could not see. This was not only tactical pressure. It was national pressure. Emotional pressure. And according to many accounts, pressure from darker forces around Colombian football. Imagine walking onto the pitch knowing your country expects victory. Then imagine knowing that some people who expect victory are not just disappointed fans. They are dangerous men. That is the hidden horror of this story. The world saw footballers. But some of those footballers may have felt like hostages of expectation. Escobar stood in defense, trying to do his job. He was not there to create history. He was there to prevent danger. To clear crosses. To block shots. To protect Colombia's goal. Then, in the 35th minute, the ball came across the area. Escobar stretched out his leg. And everything changed. The ball came from the American left side. It was low, fast, and dangerous. In that moment, Andrés Escobar had to react. A defender does not have time to think about history. He does not think about headlines. He does not think about national shame. He sees danger and tries to stop it. He reached for the ball. His touch was supposed to send it away from goal. Instead, it redirected the ball past his own goalkeeper. The net moved. The United States had scored. Andrés Escobar had scored against Colombia. There is a special kind of silence after an own goal. It is not the silence of a missed chance. It is worse. It is the silence of disbelief. The player knows immediately. His teammates know. The goalkeeper knows. The crowd knows. There is nowhere to hide. Escobar looked devastated, but he kept playing. That matters. He did not collapse. He did not disappear. He stayed on the pitch and finished the match because that is what professionals do. But the match had turned. The United States later scored again. Colombia pulled one back, but it was not enough. The game ended 2-1 to the United States. One of the tournament favorites had lost to the host nation. For American football, it was a famous victory. For Colombia, it was humiliation. For Escobar, it was the beginning of the end. After the match, the mistake was replayed again and again. Television showed it. Newspapers discussed it. Fans analyzed it. People asked how it could happen. Some called it bad luck. Others looked for someone to blame. And blame is a dangerous thing when a nation is angry. Colombia did win their final group match against Switzerland, but the damage had already been done. They were eliminated from the tournament. The dream was over. The players had to return home. That sounds simple. But for Andrés Escobar, going home meant returning to the country where the disappointment was waiting. Where gamblers may have lost money. Where armed men had pride. Where football was not always protected from violence. Some people advised him not to go out. But Escobar did not want to hide. He believed he had made an honest mistake. He believed life had to continue. He believed he owed his country dignity even in defeat. That belief would take him into the night. After Colombia's elimination, Andrés Escobar did something important. He did not run from the mistake. He faced it. He wrote words meant to calm the anger. He reminded people that football was not the end of life. He tried to bring perspective to a country drowning in disappointment. He wanted people to understand that defeat was painful, but it was not worth hatred. That is what made him different. Some players would have disappeared. Some would have refused to speak. Some would have blamed others. Escobar did not. He accepted the pain, but he refused to let it become poison. He wanted Colombia to breathe. But Colombia was not calm. The national team's failure was being discussed everywhere. The own goal had become a symbol. To some, it represented bad luck. To others, failure. To others, shame. In a country already carrying years of violence, the emotional reaction was intense. Andrés returned to Medellín. Medellín was not just any city. It was a city with deep scars from the drug war. Pablo Escobar had been killed only months earlier, in December 1993, but the violence connected to the cartel era had not simply disappeared. Power had shifted. Old enemies remained. Armed men still existed. Fear still existed. In that atmosphere, a footballer's mistake could be twisted into something bigger. Friends and family reportedly urged Andrés to stay home. They were worried. They understood the anger. They understood Colombia. They understood that public disappointment could become dangerous. But Andrés did not want to live like a prisoner. He had done nothing criminal. He had not betrayed his country. He had not thrown a match. He had not acted with malice. He had simply made the kind of mistake that football can produce in a fraction of a second. So he went out. On the night of July 1st, into the early hours of July 2nd, Andrés Escobar went to a Medellín nightclub area. To him, perhaps, it was an act of normal life. A way to show he was not hiding. A way to breathe after the pressure of the World Cup. But outside that nightclub, the mistake found him again. This time, it was not on a television replay. It was in the mouths of men who would not let him walk away. The final scene of Andrés Escobar's life did not happen in a stadium. It happened in a parking lot. There were no floodlights. No referee. No whistle. No crowd chanting his name. No teammates beside him. No defenders to cover him. No goalkeeper behind him. Just Andrés, his car, the night, and men who had decided to confront him. According to reports, Escobar was harassed about the own goal. The insults were not just ordinary anger. They were cruel, personal, and threatening. They mocked the mistake that had already wounded him deeply. Andrés could have driven away. But according to accounts, he tried to reason with them. That detail is heartbreaking because it sounds exactly like the man people described. Calm. Dignified. Rational. He reportedly tried to explain that the own goal had been an honest mistake. In a normal world, that should have been enough. In a normal world, a footballer should not have to explain his humanity in a parking lot. But this was not a normal moment. The confrontation escalated. A gun appeared. Shots were fired. Andrés Escobar was hit multiple times. The man who had tried to represent Colombia with honor was left dying because a football mistake had become tangled in ego, anger, violence, and possibly gambling losses. He was taken for medical help, but he did not survive. He was only 27 years old. The news moved through Colombia like a wound reopening. And then it moved through the world. A footballer had been murdered after scoring an own goal at the World Cup. That sentence sounded impossible. Football fans everywhere struggled to understand it. How could a game lead to this? How could one mistake on a pitch in California be followed by bullets in Medellín? How could a defender lose his life because the ball touched his leg at the wrong angle? The horror of the case was not only the murder. It was the message it sent. In some places, football was no longer only sport. It had become life, death, money, pride, and punishment. After the killing, police arrested Humberto Muñoz Castro. He was not a famous football figure. He was not a national team player. He was connected to powerful people. Reports identify him as a driver for Santiago Galán, a man alleged to have links to Colombia's criminal world. Muñoz Castro confessed to the killing. He was sentenced to 43 years in prison. But he served only 11 years. That detail still angers many people because it makes the case feel unfinished. A young man was killed. A nation mourned. A world was shocked. Yet the person convicted did not spend a lifetime behind bars. But even with a confession and conviction, the deeper truth remained unclear. Was Andrés Escobar killed because of the own goal? Was it revenge for gambling losses? Was it a confrontation with violent men whose pride had been insulted? Was it connected to the criminal atmosphere surrounding Colombian football? Was it all of these things colliding in one fatal night? Different accounts have given different interpretations. Some believe he was killed directly because people lost money on Colombia's World Cup failure. Others argue the own goal was the spark, but the murder was really about ego, intimidation, and the violent culture of the time. The Guardian reported that the Galán brothers were cleared of wrongdoing, while speculation around the case continued. That uncertainty is part of the horror. Because the official story can name a shooter. But it cannot fully explain the world that made the shooting possible. Andrés Escobar did not die only because of a football mistake. He died in a society where violent men could attach deadly meaning to a mistake. He died in a country where football had become mixed with money, pride, crime, and national identity. That is why his former coach's words matter so much. Francisco Maturana later argued that Andrés was not killed by football. He was a footballer killed by society. That sentence changes the whole case. Because the own goal was not the murderer. The murderer was the environment that turned an own goal into an excuse. When Andrés Escobar died, Colombia did not simply lose a footballer. It lost a symbol. More than 100,000 people reportedly filed past his body to pay respects. Thousands gathered to mourn. Fans cried in the streets. Flowers were thrown. Chants for justice echoed. People who had been angry after the World Cup were now devastated by what that anger had become. The country looked at itself and saw something terrible. A man who had tried to represent dignity had been killed in a way that made Colombia's international image even darker. Instead of being remembered for beautiful football, Colombia became linked to one of the most shocking tragedies in World Cup history. The grief was not just for Andrés. It was for Colombian sport. For Colombian identity. For the dream that football could lift the country above violence. Escobar had believed football could help change how the world saw Colombia. He believed success on the pitch could show another side of the nation. A side of talent, respect, teamwork, and hope. But his death became the opposite image. It told the world that violence could reach even the most respected people. Even the gentleman. Even the player who had tried to calm everyone down. That is why the funeral was so powerful. It was not only mourning. It was shame. It was regret. It was a nation asking how it had reached a point where a footballer could be killed after a game. And yet, in that grief, Andrés Escobar became something larger than the own goal. He became a reminder that players are human beings. They carry pressure. They carry mistakes. They carry fear. They carry the emotional weight of countries that sometimes forget they are only men playing a sport. The own goal lasted 1 second. The mourning lasted decades. And even now, when people speak about the darkest moments in World Cup history, they do not only talk about the ball crossing the line. They talk about Andrés. The man behind the mistake. The Andrés Escobar case is terrifying because it reveals what can happen when sport becomes too heavy for the people inside it. Football is supposed to be emotional. That is why people love it. Fans cry, celebrate, scream, pray, and dream because the game makes them feel alive. But when emotion becomes obsession, football can become dangerous. In most countries, a player who makes a mistake faces criticism. In Escobar's case, criticism became part of a deadly atmosphere. That is why this case still matters. It asks uncomfortable questions. How much pressure should a player carry? When does national pride become cruelty? When does fan anger become dehumanization? When does sport become something darker than sport? Andrés Escobar did not miss a penalty in a small match. He scored an own goal at the World Cup, in front of millions, while playing for a country already loaded with political, social, and criminal pressure. That is what made the mistake dangerous. Not the ball itself. The meaning people attach to it. The tragedy also shows how quickly a player can be reduced to one moment. Andrés had a life before that own goal. A career. A family. Friends. Faith. Principles. Dreams. But history nearly swallowed all of that and left only the mistake. That is unfair. And it is exactly why a documentary must tell the full story. Do not make Andrés only the man who scored an own goal. Make him the man who tried to stand for dignity in a country where dignity was under attack. Make him the man who went home when others might have hidden. Make him the man who tried to explain that a mistake was just a mistake. Make him the man whose death exposed the sickness around football, money, and violence. Because the true horror is not that a defender put the ball into his own net. The true horror is that some people believed this was enough reason for him to die. And that is what makes this case different from every other World Cup mistake. Other own goals become memes. This one became a funeral. Every football match ends with a whistle. The whistle tells players the battle is over. Whatever happened on the pitch is finished. Win or lose, they shake hands. They walk away. They return to life. But for Andrés Escobar, the final whistle did not end the match. The game followed him. It followed him from Pasadena to Colombia. From the Rose Bowl to Medellín. From the penalty area to a parking lot. From a mistake to a murder. And that is why his story still feels like a horror story from the World Cup. Because it should not have happened. A defender should be allowed to make a mistake. A footballer should be allowed to lose. A team should be allowed to disappoint. A country should be allowed to grieve defeat without turning grief into violence. But in 1994, the line between football and death was crossed. Andrés Escobar was 27 years old. He had a future. He had dignity. He had already given Colombia more than one painful moment could erase. But the world remembers him through tragedy because tragedy is loud. Still, his story does not end only in darkness. It also leaves a warning. Never turn players into enemies because they fail. Never confuse football with war. Never let pride become cruelty. Never forget that behind every shirt is a human being. The own goal was an accident. The murder was not. That difference must never be forgotten. In the final image of this documentary, return to the pitch. The ball rolls across the grass. Escobar stretches his leg. The ball changes direction. The net moves. The crowd erupts. Freeze the frame there. Because in that single frame, the world saw a football mistake. But history was about to reveal something much darker. A mistake can happen in 1 second. A society's violence takes years to build. Andrés Escobar did not die because football is cruel. He died because the world around football became cruel. The final whistle blew in Pasadena. But the real ending came days later in Medellín. 6 bullets. 1 own goal. 1 country in mourning. And a World Cup story no one has ever been able to forget.